And our next speakers, we're going to invite Julie Fitzinger back as our co-host and let her share who she is talking with. Go ahead, Julie.
Good morning again, everyone. I have the privilege to be speaking with Dr. Louise Aronson this morning. And Dr. Aronson is a leading geriatrician, writer, educator, and professor of medicine at the University of California in San Francisco. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Elderhood, Refining Aging, Transforming Medicine, Reimagining Life, which is available at bookstores, libraries, and as an audiobook, also large print version, also on Kindle, so you can get it everywhere. Dr. Aronson is the recipient of McDonald Fellowship. She has 4 Pushcart nominations. She is a regular contributor to the New York Times, the New England Journal of Medicine. She was awarded Teacher of the Year Award from the American Geriatric Society, and she is has a gold professorship for humanism in medicine. I hope I got that, and I'm sure there's much more. So welcome, Louise. I'm excited to talk to you today.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks.
Great. Well, as I mentioned, I highly encourage people to pick up Elderhood in whatever form they like. It's a fascinating book. And so just to start off here, I thought we would talk about the idea of stories, because throughout Elderhood, you have woven many stories, personal stories, but also stories of patients that you've worked with over the years. And everyone has a story. Everyone's story is powerful, no matter what our age is, no matter what our circumstances. So tell me a little bit about why stories inspire you and how we can learn from each other's stories.
Oh, I love that question. I think stories are our fundamental means of communication. There's not a culture or society that doesn't begin with stories, doesn't define themselves as individuals or as a group with stories. We tell stories to our kids from the very beginning. It's sort of how we make sense of the world. And I've always loved them. I was a kid who liked to read and imagine myself as, a spy or a basketball player or a variety of other entirely unlikely things. And then when I became a doctor, I kind of realized that doctoring is a lot about stories, really listening to people's stories for what they say, for what they don't say. And I just felt full up with them, and that was how I ended up getting a writing degree. So I thought it would be 2 different worlds for me, but pulling them together lets me do what we sometimes call as educators edutainment. The book should be entertaining, so that's my writer hat, but also full of interesting and useful information, which is more my doctor hat. And pulling them together, I think, I do it pretty explicitly, but I think we all do it all the time.
Right. That's great. And to just sort of tie that together, as I said, there's so much rich content in this book, but one thing that struck my attention was a section where you talk about, in your profession, you are very responsible for electronic medical record keeping. And so because of the focus on data, you and all other doctors, you have to be on the computer, jotting down notes, but that sort of becomes a little bit of a stumbling block for telling the stories, like the anecdotal, what you're seeing, what you're hearing from the folks who are sitting in front of you. So data will never go away. That's important. You have to capture all that. But how, as a doctor, do you try and sort of bridge that gap in those meetings with people where they might be frightened about what's going on, they may feel a little alone or something? Like, how do you sort of bridge that gap?
Well, if they're feeling frightened, or if they're a brand new patient to me, or if it's just one of those moments where, you can feel them as a human being.
Yeah.
I don't type on the computer. I also have a notepad and a pen where I scribble some notes so that I, get it right later, because if I've got a full clinic,
Right.
Leaving it to memory, it becomes a less good idea with the passing years, so I make sure I get it down. But it's an interesting thing because they kind of set us up that way. The most efficient doctors will simply type while you're in the room without exception and be essentially done with their notes when the patient leaves. Mm-hmm. But what the medical record wants from us isn't the story. It's, have you done this and have you done that?
Yeah.
And so if you want to also tell a story, you have to click all those boxes and put in the required information. But for me, I spend time both before I see a patient going through their record and their stories, and then after, pulling it together into a coherent story, because that enables me to know them and pull together what's going on with them. But it takes a lot of time, and that is time we are not compensated for. It's not built into the system.
Right.
And the records have some huge advantages. When people come from even outside my system, I can see their past notes in many cases. That is huge. But the disadvantage is that if you want to tell the patient's story, and even the story of how you're interpreting things and putting them together, that comes out of your personal time. And so I'm academic, I only see patients a few times a week. I can make that happen. But if you're a full-time clinician, that's virtually impossible.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So another thing I noticed when I was reading your book was about language. And I think as a writer, you have choose your words very carefully. You tell stories so well. But one specific part of language I'd like to talk about is that how in society, all of us should choose our words more carefully when it relates to what's sort of called elder speak. We've written a lot about that on Next Avenue, the diminutive forms of language. You refer to the word cute in your book about how it's really infantilizing and insulting when you're talking to an older adult. And so how do you think that this kind of language is really damaging to discourse, this infantilizing language to describe an older person?
Well, it's interesting because sometimes people will literally move into a baby voice or not speak to the human being in front of them, who might be, fully functional, just old, or might have some challenges, but that doesn't mean a person doesn't want to have social interactions or conversations. And so it's just sort of short-sighted for all of us as human beings, since most of us will become old if we're not there already. It's inconsiderate. It has a sort of ableism to take it beyond aging to a more general thing. It disadvantages so many different types of people, and this is just the elder speak version of that. I'm kind of two minds about cute. I think cute is bad when used in an infantilized way, but in my dating years, if people liked a boy or a girl, you would say he or she was cute, and actually had a sex appeal and a perfectly adult ring to it. So I don't think cute is always infantilizing. It might be less the word than the way people use it.
Yes.
And I think that's true for all the language around old age, because when you poll people, they don't like any of the descriptors. And that's not about the language. That's about social prejudice.
Right, exactly. Yes, that's very true. There are a lot of other different words too, but it's just, it all gets to, as you pointed out, the notion of respect. Respecting each other. We should all respect each other no matter how old we are. I mean, that's just a basic human behavior. It should be.
I mean, if somebody calls me an adult or middle-aged person, I don't feel insulted or diminished.
Right.
And the same should be the case if somebody calls you old or elderly or something else. In the medical literature, we're required to use the phrase older adult, and that's based on surveys. And that's what people prefer. But I feel like it's ageist, because yes, we're often older than some people, but at some point we're frankly old. We all know that. Like, certainly, where you draw the line is very personal, but I think we could all agree somebody who's 90 or 106 is old. And adult, by pulling that in, you sort of increase the power, but that means that you're admitting basically that being an elder is not a powerful position, and I reject that argument.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. That's very true. So I learned many things in your book, but one thing was the definition in Latin of imagination, which is picture to oneself. So how do you think, this is sort of switching gears a little bit, how do you think that tapping into our imaginations can help all of us be true to ourselves as we grow older? And also how finding that creativity through our imagination, through how we perceive ourselves, can help us to be more resilient as we are faced with different challenges in life. How can we learn from that word and make that really our own, and be comfortable with who we are?
I think that's one of the best questions about aging, because almost everybody has the feeling, and I've been told this by patients for 25 years, and I have in more recent years had the experience myself, where you feel just like yourself. And when our identity forms, we are young. And so then you look in the mirror, and I have patients tell me all the time, I feel like me, and then I look in the mirror and I think, who's that old man? Who's that old woman, right? And this appears to be a human universal. So I think one of the key ways we can and should engage our imaginations is imagining our more mature, older selves, and imagining who that person is, who he, she, or they can be in the world, and letting that guide a new version, because life would become pretty boring if we stayed as the same us, and we don't. And given that we don't, why not participate in creating an older you that you like, or that gets to do things, with age, sometimes you can't do things that you used to do, or you can't do them in the same ways. And there's abundant data, plus, again, years of experience show that the people who will say, okay, I can't do that anymore in that way, but I'm going to do it this way, and they still get to do it, are so much happier. And we now know that that happiness, that sort of adaptability, correlates with better health outcomes, living not just longer, but better. So the imagination is how we adapt to our new selves and how we create our new selves. You are basically the artist of yourself. And yes, of course, there are economic constraints and social and cultural constraints. But we always have constraints in life. And so work with the materials you have. I sort of, like, you can give kids a spoon and they'll play with it. And you can give certain entrepreneurs, like $10 and they'll make a company. And that's sort of, you don't need a lot to create a self.
I love that you are the artist of yourself. I think that's just such a smart and insightful statement. We should remember that every day. All of us should remember that every day. We are the artists of ourselves. I love that. I love that. Okay, so speaking about artists, we talked a little bit about this the other day too. In your book, you quote a lot of writers, poets Donald Hall, Claudia Rankine, writer Carl Nosgard, and Bruce Springsteen, and you just bring sort of these cultural figures as little touch points just throughout your book. And so I'm just curious, as you were writing Elderhood, how did that sort of process come about? Like, how did you think, now I'd like to write about Bruce Springsteen? How did that happen?
Well, part of it was I had a contract for this book for many years before I actually had time to write it. And I kept sort of collecting things and reading things because I'm endlessly fascinated by aging and old age. And then when I really sat down to write the book, obviously it has a lot about medicine and health, because that's my life. But I felt like one of the key messages was that what happens and does not happen in medicine and health in terms of aging and old people is precisely what happens and doesn't happen in our larger society. So I wanted to pull in from, popular culture and history and people who deal with other sorts of oppression and disadvantage to show how this is all part and parcel of the same larger social system, and that the influences are all related, that I'm not just talking about medicine and healthcare. I'm talking about lives and how we live. And plus, those people are also smart and interesting. And so it was just sort of a pleasure to, both in the form of the book and in the content, show how there is a weave that makes each of our lives, and that all these things are part of it.
Right. I love that. I love that. So with so many demands on your life every day, I was just wondering, where do you find your creative spark?
Ooh, well, I don't always get to exercise it.
Right.
But I think I'm very much I'm my best, most creative person first thing in the morning. So get that clear slate.
Okay.
Also being outside, walking, exercising, that's also a proven thing. It sort of stimulates the brain. It's kind of why we also advise that to anyone at any age, but particularly as you're getting older, or if your brain isn't quite doing what you want, the more you can walk and exercise, the more you get blood and stimulation to the brain. So often, even just walking my dog, who stops constantly, will be a moment of inspiration. Male dog. So there's a lot of sniffing and stopping. And then, my patients and other things I read. I mean, I just find other people really inspiring. People I see on the street, people I get the tremendous pleasure of talking to in my clinic. Interesting things I read. I find it everywhere, really. I think if you're kind of looking for it and open to it, you can make use of most things.
That's great. That's great. And that's something everybody can do every day. Just, and like you said, a short walk or get some fresh air or just kind of get yourself revved up. I love that. So, okay, the other thing I was going to ask you about was books that you like to read. I'm going to ask you, what are the 3 books on your nightstand right now that you're trying to get to, or that you read every night, or what are you interested in right now?
I go back and forth between nonfiction and fiction. So right now I'm reading, for nonfiction, Arthur Kleinman's Soul of Care. He and I are on a panel together, I think in March, that will be on C-SPAN and is at the Tucson Book Festival. And he has also, you'll see he's quoted in my book. He was one of the people who really got me thinking about how culture influences lives and health. And that was when I was in college, so probably the 80s. So really interesting to come back to him after so many decades. And then I have 2 books of fiction. I have Ocean Vuong, who started as a poet and has had this book last year that was raved about, On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, and already just the language and the story, tremendous. And then I have Yaa Gyasi's Homecoming also. I tend, for these books that are uber popular, to read them a year or 2 later. I can't really explain that behavior. It's maybe childish, but that's always what I do. So I know these books were hugely popular a year ago, but I'm finally getting to them. And looking forward to both.
That's great. That's wonderful. Well, I should stop and see if we have any questions that have come in for Dr. Aronson. It'd be great to find out. Katie?
You touched on this, Louise, a question from the audience, but I think you could go a little deeper maybe well, let me read it more specifically. I'm not going to ad lib. All right, so from the audience, I enjoyed your interview with Terry Gross on NPR so much, especially your candid and helpful conversation around loss. What can you share with us about tapping into resiliency and creativity when facing loss as an older adult?
Oh, such a good and critically important point. There's a lot about sort of healthy aging or anti-ageism lately that really focuses on, what might be called the easier or early years of elderhood. But the fact is, if you live into your later 70s, 80s, and beyond, you're going to have lost people who meant a lot to you, and you may have lost certain roles that meant a lot to you. And that's a fact. So I think, but I think it's a fact that doesn't acknowledge the ways in which we as a society contribute to that. So there's less and less interaction among generations. And if we had more intergenerational relationships, like Katie, I love that you're doing this with your very young face on the screen. It's fabulous. I think if we had more relationships like that, I mean, obviously a friendship of 5 years or 20 years isn't going to replace one of 60 years, but it gives you an ongoing network. And if you don't have that, are there interests or activities or places where you could go and meet some people who, and younger might mean somebody who's 60 or 50, it doesn't have to be, or 75. It can mean lots of different things. I think for creativity, you can pull that in a variety of ways, like being creative about what sort of place that you might go to that maybe isn't the sort of place you ever would have gone to before, or maybe it's an artistic sort of place, because art, we have around San Francisco all these banners that say creativity, oh God, and now I'm going to get it wrong. Oh, I have some on my desk here. Creativity never gets old. Um, so, and intelligence never gets old, etc. So engaging in that way. And then again, that sort of self-invention, thinking about, okay, I'm feeling sad. And I think also allowing yourself to feel sad, but trying not to have that completely cripple you. Like every day, can you do something that will nourish you? And as you get further from the loss, add more things in. And again, exercise releases endorphins, which are happy hormones and chemicals in your brain. So just getting out and getting some sun on you, if there is anywhere you live. A little biased to California there. But even any kind of fresh air and seeing trees or anything, if there's a park near you, things like that can really help. Maybe remembering activities that you didn't have time to do in adulthood. Elderhood is really good for going back to those things and going back to them without the pressure of, I can't do this if I can't make a living from it. You know, you have a stronger sense of self with which to say like, hey, so I'm not the world's best pianist or painter or, you know, whatever it is, I like this and I'm going to work on getting better at it because that just feels good.
That's
So good.
yeah.
It reminds me of the conversations I've had a lot with the next speaker, Lucky Goff, around sometimes in older age, you're able to let go of the economic value that you must have in our society, right? And that is like cracks wide open for exploration.
Right. It's called in the gerontology literature, it's called a stage of greater freedom, because you're away from those pressures of having, when you're really young, you're trying to establish yourself as a person of some, you know, meaning or worth or talent or ability or income or something. And then you're sort of striving through adulthood. I mean, in most big studies, adulthood is the time of most stress and striving. And so then in elderhood, you're kind of liberated, and to see that not just in terms of loss, but as opportunity, really helps. It's amazing how even playing little mind games with yourself can really make a difference in how you feel and what you're able to do and how you can appreciate what you are able to do.
Agreed. And there's research, right, backing that up, that how you view aging. Yeah.
Yeah. And about attitudes in terms of health. I mean, there's really interesting research showing that if people have negative attitudes about aging, they recover less well from illness. They're more likely to have Alzheimer's markers in their spinal fluid. You know, they have heart disease years earlier, and there's even more data on kind of optimism and health outcomes. And that's a little loaded again, right? Because some people have more reasons to be optimistic. If you're born wealthy and you've never been hungry and you had all these opportunities, you might be a more optimistic person than a person who didn't have all those other things. But it turns out we can cultivate it, you know, and that we see people across the economic spectrum who are optimists. And so there is question about, are there ways you can do that? Or if you know someone who is that, can you get them to kind of help you? You say something, they reframe it in an optimistic way, and you just kind of practice it. And it feels weird and awkward at first, and eventually it becomes more second nature.
Love that. And it's really touching on a question we got from the audience around the, you know, when you're trying to reinvent yourself and coming up against some pretty big obstacles related to aging, you know, what skills are most useful? And I think you touched on that quite a bit. Is there anything you'd want to add to that? Or?
I would add that I have increasingly seen groups of older people banding together so that you have a support system. And I guess I would have a corollary to that was it doesn't need to be old people altogether. Like it often is because of our segregated ageist society, but invite other people in. I have a colleague, Dr. Joanne Lynn, who many years ago said one of my favorite sayings, which is, you know, for people who aren't yet old, we are all old people in training. And the more that we work intergenerationally, the more we are all prepared to thrive as we get older. And we learn how to do that by helping others thrive. But if you're running up against people, there are so many older people banding together in various ways to support each other and create networks that provide happiness and meaning and purpose.
Perfect. We'll talk about that in our next speaker too, about how to find those
Yeah, I didn't even know that. Yay!
Dive right into that. Another question from the audience for Louise. What are you looking forward to as you get older?
Ooh, well, right now I work probably 80, 85 hours a week, and I'm looking forward to doing less work, although I love, love, love what I do. I am looking forward to getting a little more healthy, because even though I spend a lot of time talking about health and aging, I'm working so much that my own health is not being tended to as well as it might. I'm looking forward to more time for reading and writing, things I love, but I do less of in the years where I need to make a living and get our family some health insurance. So I think many things. I guess maybe I'm looking forward to being surprised by who I become, because already I'm surprised by the last decade of my life. And I hope that I continue to be surprised in ways that I can see as positive, even though there are obviously associated, particularly physical disappointments. You know, that I think, yes, there are disappointments and there are so many other good things. And I have literally spent the last few years, partly because I was writing the book, training myself in that way we were just talking about, which is how I know it works. Or one of the ways. There's also data, not just my experience, but really focusing more on those positive things and feeling good about them.
So good. Julie, anything else from your end?
No, I think that's great. Wow, that's you've had some just really inspiring ideas for people, and it's just been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for your awesome questions. That made it really fun and easy.
Ditto. Thank you so much for joining, Louise. We couldn't get to all the audience questions. I apologize. We'll move on to our next speaker and let Louise have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Enjoy the conference.
Alrighty, and thanks, Julie. I appreciate your co-hosting there.
Thank you.
It's been lovely to have you today.
Thank you very much, Katie. I've enjoyed it.